With only 252 days to go, excitement is really starting to build right across Europe. I'm talking, of course, about the European elections. And here at the Daily Politics, the countdown is on to the vote in May next year. And it's not just us who are gearing up. Our friends at the European Parliament have released a promotional advert to highlight the event. And here's a taster.
Look back. Look ahead. We all face many choices and many issues. We all have our own views. But in Europe, every opinion gets a fair chance. The decisions of the European Parliament are driven by everything that matters to you. You have the power to decide.
Well, all very high-minded, but it wasn't like that yesterday when President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, laid into UK Conservatives in the European Parliament, boldly predicting they'd be beaten by UKIP in next year's elections. Here's what he had to say.
I think increasingly your party and your group is looking like the UKIP and the Eurosceptic anti-European group. And I start to have some doubts that you are going to be elected yourself in Britain if it's not UKIP that is going to be the first force in the British elections. Because when it comes to be against Europe, the people prefer, between the original and the copy, they prefer the original. That's probably why they are going to vote more for Mr. Farage than for Mr. Callanan. And this I don't say with any kind of satisfaction, because we have, even if we have some differences, we have worked in many areas very constructively with Conservatives, the British Conservatives and the Conservative group.
First of all, thank Mr. Barroso for the unsolicited electoral advice for my party. It's a bit rich for the unelected head of the European Commission to give us electoral advice about how to pay for elections, but I suppose that's typical of him.
Well, I'm joined now from Strasbourg by the man ending that clip, leader of the European Conservative and Reformist group, Martin Callanan. And with me in the studio is UKIP leader Nigel Farage. Welcome to both of you. Martin Callanan, first of all, are you, as José Manuel Barroso suggests, just a copy of UKIP rather than the real thing?
No, of course we're not. It's a bit of an unholy alliance, isn't it? Nigel has spent the last 9 years being very rude about Mr. Barroso, saying he has no credibility. And now when he tipped UKIP in the European elections, he's become the fount of all electoral wisdom. You know, England's Peter Kellner. I think the serious thing is that Mr. Barroso is actually getting worried. You know, David Cameron is delivering on the European reform agenda. He's cut Manuel Barroso's budget. He wants to reduce the number of commissioners from 28 down to 6. And more importantly, he's actually going to deliver on a referendum on the UK's membership.
But Martin Callanan, he obviously doesn't believe that your Euroscepticism is as authentic as Nigel Farage's. Hence, when it comes to being against Europe, people prefer the original to the copy. I mean, is all of this a bid by you and your colleagues to try and up your profile because you're running scared of UKIP?
Well, of course, José Manuel Barroso knows that Nigel, and I like Nigel, and I think he's in politics for all the right motives, can't deliver on the reform agenda. You know, Nigel is no threat to Mr. Barroso. He stands up and is rude about him in the chamber, and that's as far as it goes. You know, he's worried that his budget is being cut, his commissioners are being reduced, and there'll be a referendum if the Conservative Party are elected.
Right, Nigel.
And, you know, I think there's a bit of an unholy alliance between Nigel and Mr. Barroso.
Yes, well, we'll come to
Nigel to win.
All right, well, let's put that to Nigel Farage. You're no threat at all to José Manuel Barroso. In fact, you're being used as the stick to beat the Conservatives with.
What's going on here is clearly Mr. Barroso was expressing his frustration. He knows David Cameron, he likes David Cameron, and he knows that Mr. Cameron is one of the big supporters of the European project. David Cameron's always said he believes it's brought us peace and prosperity, and it's the way to fight climate change. So Barroso is frustrated with Cameron, but he's very, very frightened of UKIP and the UKIP argument. Not just in the United Kingdom. His real concern is that actually right across Europe, the kind of arguments that I've been using and we've used in the chamber are now gaining in support. And that's what he's really scared of. It's not reform that Mr. Barroso's afraid of. What he's afraid of is people leaving the Union.
Right, but let's take up the point that Martin Callanan actually made, is that you don't have it in your gift anyway to make the reforms that you promised.
I don't want to reform it. I don't want to reform it. It's unreformable. Why are we wasting our time? Every Prime Minister for the last 40 years has talked about reform. It's unreformable.
Right, well, Martin Callanan, isn't that the point? That is why UKIP is gaining in support, because there is a clear message there, whereas they don't trust or they don't quite know where David Cameron is. Is he on the side of Jose Manuel Barroso, or is he, as you've attempted to say, actually he's fighting tooth and nail against the institutions?
Well, Nigel says he wants to leave the European Union. That's, in my view, a very valid view. Therefore, that he should be supporting David Cameron's policy of having a referendum, and Nigel can campaign to leave.
If you say you have it next Thursday, I'll support it.
He has been campaigning for a referendum. We are going to give him a referendum. Surely that's something that he should support.
Right.
I mean, this is laughable, isn't it? I mean, 5 times in the last 2 years, David Cameron publicly said, I do not wish there to be a referendum on our membership of the EU. Forced by UKIP rising in the polls, he now promises one in 4.5 years' time, if he wins the election and after a renegotiation. And all he's really doing is he's kicking the issue into the long grass. We want a referendum as soon as possible.
Right, but Nigel Farage, you and Martin...
But Nigel can't obtain a referendum as soon as possible. He doesn't have one member in the House of Commons. Jose Manuel Barroso clearly believes that there's going to be a referendum.
And in the end, Nigel Farage, you're going to split the vote. And that is a problem for you and for the Conservatives. That you could say that you and Martin actually aren't that far apart.
Well,
so you're going to split the vote.
It's very interesting you say that, because Mr Callanan and I had a conversation about this yesterday.
Oh, yes.
And he agrees with me that in the north of England, we are splitting the vote. We're splitting the Labour vote. And it's something about you guys in the London media, you really don't understand it. You all think that Euroscepticism is a right-wing view. It is not.
No, but there are many Conservatives who believe you are going to split the vote.
And there are more Labour, Lib Dems and non-voters who feel that way too.
But they do exist in the Conservatives, and we are talking to the Conservatives today about the position.
The point is, UKIP draws its support from across the spectrum.
OK, let's think about the polls. Do you think you're going to top the poll next year?
I think we've got a very good chance.
Right. That's a real problem, isn't it, Martin Callanan? Do you agree with Nigel Farage that they've got a real chance of topping the European elections next year?
Well, we're going to fight for every vote in the European elections. The Conservative Party has won the last 3 European elections. Clearly, it's going to be difficult because we're now a governing party, but we will be fighting to win the elections like we fight to win every election. Of course, I want the Conservative Party to win, and I hope we do very well.
Pauline Neville-Jones?
Well, I think my party has actually got to put forward the argument for the reform agenda. It's absolutely crucial. If it actually wants to convince the British public that this is something worth working for and that we should stay in the European Union, it does actually have to start fighting for the reform agenda. I believe in that. I mean, I think it's going to be a tough negotiation. What is very, very clear, however, is if we don't have some friends in the European Union, we won't get anywhere. So it's very important, actually, that the Conservatives do 2 things. One is actually that my party puts out a credible reform agenda, and secondly, that they argue for it, both inside the European Union and with the British electorate. I do think we've got to get active. Otherwise, I do think, that Nigel's got a strong hand.
Well, he's got every chance, hasn't he? He doesn't have to, as Prime Minister, open the door on the 1st of January next year to 28 million poor Romanians and Bulgarians. That would show a British Prime Minister really acting in the national interest.
Martin Callanan, what do you say to that?
I think that, of course, we need to be aware of the threat of too much immigration. Most people, I don't think, have a problem with people who come to genuinely work and pay taxes in the UK, but we have to make sure that the benefit system is not abused, and we have to make sure that our judicial system is not abused. And I think the government is actively looking at that and will ensure that that is the case.
How's the repatriation of powers going?
It's going extremely well.
Really?
I mean, because the threat of a referendum is driving the other European governments to negotiate. Already Angela Merkel has conceded that she can envisage powers being returned to member states. Manuel Barroso is clearly very worried about it. You know, he knows that Nigel talks a good talk, and he knows that I think he says a lot of very valid things, but he is no threat to the European Commission.
There's a lot more support for the British.
He has not one member in the House of Commons. So he cannot deliver a referendum.
Except that the balance of competences, that great worded review carried out by the Foreign Office, came out over the recess, buried it was to some extent, to say that actually their first report said everything was fine.
I don't think it did say everything's fine.
It did pretty well
people that I talked to.
It did pretty well say that actually the balance, certainly for their first report, wasn't in a bad place. And that's why I asked how the repatriation of powers are going.
We're losing more powers this week, because this week there are 3 voting days in Strasbourg, and every one of those days we vote for European directives which send yet more power to the European Commission. The direction of travel is towards Brussels still.
Right. I mean, Martin Callanan, do you want David Cameron to do a deal? with UKIP. Would that help before the next election so that there isn't a split of the vote on the right?
I don't want to see the vote split, but I don't see how it's possible to do a deal with another competing political party. Of course, you know, we're a very large party. We're active in every constituency across the UK. And I think it's very arrogant to say to people, individual constituencies, you know, we're not going to put up a candidate, so we want you to vote for another party. You know, support will come from across the political spectrum. I want us to fight for every vote in every constituency.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I think it's very difficult to see how we can take the votes of the electorate for granted in such a way.
Nigel Farage and Martin Callanan. I was going to say thank you at that point, I'm afraid, rather than invite you to speak again, but thank you for coming onto the programme.